Welcome back to 40k Lore Basics by Ludus Infinium. Today, we will be talking about the Imperial Army. The Imperial Army was the 30k equivalent of the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy of Warhammer 40k, and predecessor to both. Unlike the Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy of 40k, which are ground forces and air and space forces respectively, the Imperial Army was a combination of both groups, containing ground, air, and space forces. The Imperial Army was never anything more than a reserve force for the Imperium. During the Great Crusade, its troops were primarily used for garrison detail or mop-up operations. It's only in the last decades of the Great Crusade, going into the Horus Heresy, did Imperial Army troops fight alongside the Space Marine legions. Formed during the Age of Strife, the genetically enhanced soldiers known as Genos became the first units of what would be the Imperial Army, and would go on to serve as the prototypes for the Thunder Warriors, the predecessors of the Space Marine legions. The Genos proved during the Unification Wars to reunite Terra to be an effective and adaptable military force. During the same time, they practiced gene mustering, or as it's more commonly called, gene manipulation, an essential tool during those years when atomic hurricanes and drifting red clouds were common.
The genetically enhanced regiments of this period, such as the lauded Geno 52 Chiliad, would go on to become amongst some of the oldest brigades to serve in the later Imperial Army. These surviving Genos were proud members of the Old Hundred, the Strife Epoch regiments that the Emperor, in his grace, had maintained in existence after the completion of the Unification Wars, provided that they had pledged their loyalty to him. Many thousands of other Geno units had been forced to disband after the achievement of unity, depending on their level of resistance to the new order brought by the unification of Terra under the Emperor's new planetary government. The Emperor required more manpower to ensure the momentum of the Great Crusade did not falter. Each newly conquered or liberated world brought into Imperial compliance during the course of the Imperial campaign was assessed and a census taken of its population. From this, the Emperor's administrators of the Corps Logisticae, the forerunner of the later Departmentum Minatorum, calculated the tithe that each world was to pay in the form of regiments of soldiers and war material. The numbers of regiments raised from each world varied enormously in accordance with the size of each individual planet's population. Sparsely populated worlds would be tithed to supply only a handful of regiments annually, whilst the overcrowded hive worlds near to the galactic core would have to supply hundreds of regiments each standard year. Most Imperial Army regiments number approximately 3,000 troops, who would be carried to their destinations by a single dedicated troop transport vessel or one of the many available classes of Imperial cruiser. This approach ensured that an individual regiment was deployed with each warship in an expeditionary fleet. Each regiment maintained its own infantry, armor, and support troops, making it capable of both assaulting and defending varied terrain against most types of opposition. Imperial Army regimental commanders were free to train and equip their regiments as they wished, only being limited by the resources readily available. So it became the rule in the Imperial Army that each regiment was composed of troops raised from the same world, and they all traveled together on the same transport or warship of the Imperial fleet. The Imperial Army was used almost exclusively for garrison and pacification roles on both their new and foreign worlds throughout the early stages of the Great Crusade, but by the later half they were fighting offensive battles and supplementing the Space Marine legions as they began to be stretched more sparsely across the growing Imperium. The Imperial Army at this time was organized with no particular standardization, and regimental makeups ranged from barbarians wielding power axes to advanced mechanized infantry armed with energy weapons whose designs have now been lost. During this time, the regiments were left almost exclusively to their own recognizance, as long as they served faithfully and conformed to the few restrictions placed on them. A Space Marine Legion often had hundreds of auxiliary Imperial Army regiments fighting under its command. These troops were used to reinforce the Space Marines and were frequently deployed in sieges, mass invasions, and to garrison newly conquered worlds. The Imperial Army was rarely deployed within the home system of the regiments that comprised it. In fact, this was actively avoided by the Primarchs in command of these regiments to ensure that the soldiers' loyalty lay first and foremost with the individual Primarch and the Space Marine Legion to which they had been attached, and alongside which they fought. Amongst the traitor legions, almost all of their attached Imperial Army formations uniformly followed their masters into rebellion, out of fear or blind faith. Even amongst the Loyalists, Imperial Army units with an officer cadre of genetically enhanced Geno warriors performed poorly, usually driven to destruction by the inability of their unaugmented human soldiers to keep up with the demands of their transhuman Space Marine leaders. Over the course of the heresy, entire armies of mortals were raised and squandered by both the traitors and the desperate Loyalist commanders. Combined forces of fleet and army elements moved from world to world at the command of generals and lord commanders whose loyalties were unknown to both sides. Thousands of pocket empires were carved out by ambitious commanders with no true loyalty to either side. Over the course of the following centuries, and at a cost of billions of lives, the Imperium was slowly reforged, forever tainted by the blood spilt in the massive civil war which had almost destroyed it. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium, a great reform of the Imperium's bureaucratic and military structure was undertaken at the behest of the Primarch Roboute Guilliman. To prevent the possibility of a large-scale interstellar rebellion from consuming the human-settled galaxy again, the titanic armies of the Imperium were divided into three basic parts: the Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, a ground-based force of mortal soldiers that would replace the fractured Space Marine legions as the Imperium's frontline troops, and a space-based service containing all the Imperium's naval assets that was responsible for all space-related transport and combat duties. This reform led to the formation of the modern Imperial Guard and Imperial Navy. Thus, the Imperial Army, as it had been for centuries, ceased to exist. The link between the Imperial fleet and army was formally and bureaucratically severed. Never again would Imperial ground commanders be given direct control over interstellar ships or even their own units' air support. From the ashes of the Imperial Army were born the separate armed services of the Imperial Navy and the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard was reorganized into smaller units known as regiments, an existing formation from the old organization structure of the Imperial Army, and centrally trained political officers known as commissars were universally introduced to watch out for disloyalty and to keep the guardsmen and naval crews properly motivated in defense of the Imperial. This was the birth of the Imperial Guard as it exists in the late 41st millennium. Thank you all for listening to this description of the Imperial Army from the 30k universe. Now, I would like to do something a little different than normal. I will discuss the pros and cons of both the Imperial Army and what later became the Imperial Guard. I believe overall that the Imperial Army was the better strategic choice, being that it could be combined arms regiments, being both infantry and armor, mechanized, air, even space vessels. However, that being said, in the 41st millennium, and with the threat of chaos and its taint being able to corrupt even the forces of the Space Marines, there is good reason why the Imperium frowns on combined arms forces. However, there are two forces that come right to mind, being the Armageddon Steel Legion and the Death Corps of Krieg, both being combined arms regiments of the Imperial Guard, and so far reportedly neither having any regiments falling to chaos. However, for the most part in the Greater Imperium, this is not true. There have been uncountable regiments of Imperial Guard that have fallen to chaos, and as I've said before, there have even been Space Marine chapters that have fallen to chaos, so they really aren't immune to it. And having a combined arms unit fall to chaos would be extremely disastrous because they can combat almost anything that the Imperium can throw at it. Whereas a simple infantry regiment could be countered with, say, armor, or an armor regiment being countered by artillery or specialized infantry that does specialize as an armor killer regiment. However, that being said, overall, again, I think the Imperial Army was strategically the better choice. I think in the universe, however, the Imperial Guard is the necessary choice. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all made it to the end through my little digression here. And I really do appreciate every single one of you that come to watch it. I hope you all enjoy your days, have a wonderful week, and I hope to see you next time.